What happens when an army declares war on a bird? In 1932, Australia found itself in just such a predicament. The enemy, the emu, a large, flightless bird with a reputation for being tough and uncompromising. This wasn't a cartoonish skirmish, though. It was a serious attempt by the Australian government to address a real problem. The Great Emu War, as it came to be known, was a strange and ultimately unsuccessful campaign that pitted man against bird in a battle for the Australian outback. The war was more of a pest control operation that went hilariously wrong. It's a story filled with unintended consequences, political blunders, and more than a few laugh-out-loud moments. To understand the Great Emu War, we need to meet our feathered protagonist. The emu is an impressive creature, the second largest bird in the world, second only to the ostrich. Standing nearly 6 feet tall and weighing up to 100 pounds, they are formidable opponents. They can't fly, but what they lack in aerial ability, they more than make up for in speed and endurance. Imagine a creature that can sprint across the outback at 30 miles per hour, covering vast distances with ease. Emus aren't naturally aggressive, but they're also not afraid of a fight, especially when it comes to protecting their young. Their powerful legs deliver kicks that can break bones, and they're not afraid to use them. The year was 1932. The world was in the throes of the Great Depression, and Australia, a young nation heavily reliant on agricultural exports, was reeling from its impact. The stock market crash of 1929 had sent shockwaves across the globe, and Australia, heavily dependent on wool and wheat exports, was hit particularly hard. Prices for these commodities plummeted, leaving farmers struggling to make ends meet. The Australian government, desperate to alleviate the suffering of its citizens, offered subsidies and bonuses to wheat farmers, encouraging them to increase production. Farmers, eager for any relief, responded with gusto, bringing vast new areas of land under cultivation. However, the government's plan, well-intentioned though it was, had unforeseen consequences. The newly cultivated lands, carved out of the emu's natural habitat, became irresistible magnets for the hungry birds. The farmers, already grappling with the economic downturn, now faced a new threat to their livelihoods, a feathered army that descended upon their fields with an insatiable appetite. Imagine their despair as they watched helplessly, their hard work literally devoured before their very eyes. The farmers, desperate to protect their investments, tried everything they could to deter the feathered invaders. They built fences, hoping to keep the emus out, but the large birds simply walked straight through them. The farmers, at their wits' end, realized they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy that seemed to multiply by the day. The emus, for their part, were unaware of the political storm brewing around them. They were simply following their instincts, driven by a primal urge to survive. They had found an abundant food source in the farmers' fields, and they were determined to make the most of it. Their numbers swelled, their confidence grew, and they moved across the land with the unstoppable force of a feathered army. They followed the rains, knowing that fresh shoots of grain would soon follow. Farmers would watch in dismay as their fields, once promising with golden wheat, were transformed into trampled wastelands. The emus, despite their size and somewhat comical appearance, were remarkably well suited for survival in the harsh Australian outback. The farmers' pleas did not fall on deaf ears. The Australian government, already facing criticism over its handling of the Depression, saw the emu crisis as an opportunity to demonstrate its commitment to supporting its citizens. They decided to take action, and the action they chose was nothing short of extraordinary. They would send in the army. The Australian government decided that the best way to deal with a few thousand emus was to deploy a detachment of soldiers armed with Lewis machine guns. The soldiers arrived in Campion, Western Australia, ready for a fight. They had their Lewis guns, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and the full weight of the Australian government behind them. What they didn't have, it turned out, was a clear strategy for defeating an enemy that seemed to vanish into thin air at the first sign of trouble. The emus, for their part, regarded the arrival of the soldiers with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. The first encounter between the two sides was nothing short of farcical. The soldiers, attempting to employ traditional military tactics, tried to herd the emus into a concentrated area where they could mow them down with their machine guns. However, the emus, displaying an uncanny grasp of guerrilla warfare, refused to cooperate. The emus, it quickly became clear, were masters of evasion. They seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to anticipate the soldiers' movements, melting away into the scrub before the troops could get a clear shot. They used their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage, disappearing into gullies and ravines, only to reappear miles away, seemingly mocking the soldiers' efforts to contain them. The soldiers, their morale sinking with each passing day, found themselves engaged in a game of cat and mouse with an adversary that always seemed to be one step ahead. The soldiers' frustration was compounded by the fact that the emus, despite their size, were surprisingly difficult to kill. Faced with mounting criticism and the prospect of returning to Perth empty-handed, the military commanders decided a change in tactics was needed. They abandoned the futile attempts to herd the emus and instead opted for a more mobile approach, mounting their Lewis guns on the back of trucks. This, they hoped, would give them the speed and maneuverability they needed to keep up with their elusive quarry. The image of soldiers in trucks, chasing after emus with machine guns blazing, is perhaps the most enduring and comical image of the Great Emu War. However, even this new strategy proved largely ineffective. The emus, it seemed, were unfazed by the trucks. After several weeks of fruitless pursuit, the soldiers were ordered to withdraw. The Great Emu War, which had begun with such confidence, had ended in something of a humiliating defeat for the Australian army. They had fired thousands of rounds of ammunition, yet the emu population, far from being decimated, seemed to have grown larger and bolder. The soldiers returned to their barracks, leaving the emus in control of the battleground. The news of the army's retreat was met with a mixture of amusement and outrage back in Perth. The Emu War, as it quickly became known, was held up as an example of government incompetence and military absurdity. The Great Emu War had become a national joke, a cautionary tale about the perils of underestimating the enemy, even when that enemy is a flightless bird. News of the military's misadventures spread like wildfire, turning the emus into unlikely media darlings and the soldiers into figures of ridicule. Newspapers, both in Australia and internationally, couldn't resist the story's inherent humour. Headlines screamed of feathered fiends rout Australian army and emus victorious in bizarre bush battle. The story, with its David and Goliath narrative and inherent comedic value, provided a welcome distraction from the grim realities of the Depression. Editorial cartoons depicted emus wearing military helmets, pecking at fleeing soldiers, or triumphantly strutting across battlefields littered with spent bullet casings. One particularly memorable cartoon showed a group of emus gathered around a map, planning their next strategic move, while a group of disheveled soldiers cowered in a trench nearby. The emus, once considered pests, were now being portrayed as clever and resilient creatures, outsmarting their human adversaries at every turn. The soldiers, meanwhile, found themselves on the receiving end of much good-natured ribbing upon their return from the front lines. Their tales of being outsmarted by birds were met with laughter and disbelief. The Great Emu War, it seemed, was destined to become a legendary tale, passed down through generations of Australians, a humorous reminder that even the best-laid plans can go awry. The fallout from the Emu War wasn't confined to the newspapers. The debacle quickly became a political hot potato, with the opposition parties seizing on the opportunity to criticise the government's handling of the situation. Parliamentary debates grew heated as politicians argued over who was to blame for the military's embarrassing defeat. "This is a disgrace, a national humiliation," thundered one opposition member, waving a copy of a newspaper with the headline, "Emus 1, Australia 0. The government has shown itself to be utterly incompetent, incapable of even defeating a flock of birds." The government, for its part, struggled to defend its actions. They argued that the emu threat had been real and that the deployment of soldiers had been a necessary measure. They pointed out the difficulty of combating such a numerous and elusive enemy, claiming that the emus' speed and unpredictable movements had taken the soldiers by surprise. However, their explanations rang hollow in the face of such a resounding and public defeat. The Emu War, initially dismissed by some as a minor nuisance, had become a symbol of the government's perceived ineptitude. The public, already disillusioned by the Depression and the government's seeming inability to alleviate their suffering, found the whole affair both ridiculous and infuriating. The public reaction to the Great Emu War was a mixed bag of amusement, disbelief, and outrage. While many found the whole affair utterly ridiculous, others were angered by the government's perceived waste of resources and manpower. The country, it seemed, was divided on whether to laugh or cry about their army's defeat at the hands, or rather, feet, of a bunch of birds. Farmers, whose plight had been the catalyst for the entire debacle, were particularly incensed. They argued that the money spent on ammunition and military deployments could have been better used to provide them with financial assistance or to fund research into more effective methods of emu control. They pointed out that the emus, far from being deterred by the army's intervention, were now bolder than ever, continuing to wreak havoc on their crops. Others, however, saw the lighter side of the situation. The Great Emu War, with its inherent absurdity, provided a welcome respite from the doom and gloom of the Depression. People shared jokes and cartoons about the war, reveling in the irony of a mighty nation being brought low by a flightless bird. The emus, with their comical waddle and their apparent immunity to bullets, became unlikely folk heroes, symbols of resilience and a certain anarchic spirit. The Great Emu War achieved nothing in terms of its objective. The emu population continued to thrive, remaining a nuisance to farmers. Soldiers returned to their barracks, their tales of being outsmarted by birds becoming legend. The government quietly swept the affair under the rug, hoping the public would forget their defeat. While the guns fell silent, the memory of the Great Emu War lingered. It became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the best-equipped army can be defeated. The emus taught the Australian army a valuable lesson: never underestimate your opponent. The Great Emu War holds a unique place in Australian history. The tale is passed down through generations, a testament to the enduring power of a good story. The Great Emu War, despite its farcical nature, had a lasting impact on Australia. While the soldiers retreated, their pride slightly dented, the emus emerged as unlikely victors, cementing their place in Australian folklore as symbols of resilience and resourcefulness. The emus, it seemed, had successfully defended their territory, proving that they were not to be trifled with. Their victory, though bloodless, served as a potent reminder of the power of nature and the folly of underestimating one's opponent, no matter how comical they may appear. The war also forced Australians to confront their relationship with the land and its native inhabitants. The emus, once viewed as pests to be eradicated, gained a newfound respect, even admiration, for their tenacity and adaptability. The conflict highlighted the delicate balance between human development and the preservation of natural habitats, a lesson that continues to resonate in modern Australia, where conservation efforts often clash with economic interests. The emus' victory, though achieved through evasion rather than aggression, served as a humbling experience for a nation accustomed to conquering the outback. It was a reminder that the land itself and the creatures that call it home are not easily subdued. The Great Emu War, in its own strange way, contributed to a growing awareness of the need for sustainable land management practices and a greater respect for the natural world. The Great Emu War may have faded into history, but its legacy lives on in the Australian psyche. It has become a beloved anecdote, a cautionary tale often recounted with amusement and pride. The story, with its inherent absurdity and David and Goliath narrative, has lost none of its appeal over the decades. It is a story that is both uniquely Australian and universally relatable, a testament to the enduring power of a good yarn. The war has inspired artists, writers, and filmmakers. From whimsical children's books to satirical documentaries, the Great Emu War has been reimagined countless times. Its appeal lies in its comedic value and its ability to spark broader conversations. It reminds us that even well-intentioned plans can backfire, that nature often has the upper hand, and sometimes the best course is to retreat and regroup. The Great Emu War, though a military defeat, has become a cultural victory for Australia. It captures the spirit of a nation known for its humor, its resilience, and its connection to the land. The legend of the Great Emu War lives on, a humorous footnote in history, and a reminder that sometimes the best way to win a war is to not fight it at all. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification button. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below and join the conversation.